What was your biggest I fucking knew it moment? Story 1. For 6 years, my ex gaslit me into thinking I was losing my hearing. She'd mumble everything, then act exasperated when I asked her to repeat herself. I started questioning myself, maybe I really was going deaf, but then her college friends visited. 2 days in, one of them snapped, "Why are you talking so quietly? No one can hear you." My ex's face went pale. She looked at me, and in that moment I saw it. She knew she was caught. 6 years of making me feel like I was the problem. And for what? A petty little power trip? This was a grown-ass woman. I'll never understand it. Story 2. My wife swears I need hearing aids. We'll be walking, and I'll hear an entire conversation from a few feet behind us. Normal voices, clear as day. Meanwhile, my wife is mumbling some cryptic nonsense under her breath. I literally turn around and walk backward, watching her lips move, trying to make out a single word. Nothing. I tell her I can't hear her, and she just sighs like I'm the problem. It's to the point where I might just start singing, "I can't freaking hear yo" in full operatic fashion. Story 3. My wife can sit in silence for an hour, but the second I turn on the microwave or start doing dishes, suddenly she has an urgent multi-step request. But not a simple, "Can you get the kid's water bottle?" No, it's a full audiobook. I think the kid might be thirsty. I gave her a water bottle earlier, but maybe she drank it already and I don't know where it is, but check the pantry, second shelf, maybe third, or the fireplace box, or... And by the time I shout over the beeping, "Do you want me to just get the bottle?" I'm a jerk for cutting her off. Story 4. I knew my ex was cheating when she started randomly accusing me of cheating. Couldn't even watch a movie with an attractive woman in it without getting side-eyed. Then one day she says she's going to the park to relax. Felt weird. Checked her location. She wasn't at the park. When I confronted her, she spun the most bizarre, out-of-nowhere excuse I've ever heard. Dug a little deeper and, yep, she was meeting up with some guy. Funny how the most paranoid ones always have something to hide. Story 5. There was a comic book shop in my town that had a free-play Simpsons arcade machine, so my buddy and I went to check it out. But the store itself? Sketchy as hell. It had nothing but random, disorganized back-issue comics and a weird vibe. We left saying, that place is 100% a front. A year later, busted. For meth. And honestly, if I had known, I wouldn't have had to make 2 trips to play Simpsons and score meth. Efficiency matters. Story 6. A super fancy Chinese restaurant in an expensive part of town was always packed. Made bank. Then one day it was just closed. Turns out the owners had a chain of restaurants in Dallas that got busted for human trafficking. A month later, it reopened under new management. But the sign? Same. The menu? Same. The staff? Same. The sketchiness? Also the same. And yet people still lined up for dumplings. Story 7. One morning, everyone at my company was locked out of our private Facebook groups for internal work discussions. I immediately felt something was off. My coworker waved it off. Just a computer glitch. A few hours later, upper management strolled in, layoff notices in hand. My coworker turned to me, wide-eyed, and I just stared back like, "Still think I was paranoid?" Story 8. A guy in HR always gave me the creeps. His body language, his voice, just something about him felt off. One day, cops quietly showed up at our office. They spread out across the building, posted up by the exits. A few minutes later, they walked HR guy out in handcuffs. Turns out he owned rental properties and had been filming tenants in their bathrooms. Oh, and he sent threats from his work computer. The irony is overwhelming. Story 9. I always had a bad feeling about my sister borrowing my stuff. One time she wanted to wear my dress for a wedding. We fought, and I told her to find her own. The next day the dress was gone. I called her. She denied it, got mad that I even accused her. A week later, we made up. I went to her place, grabbed some comfy clothes from her closet like I always did, and she flipped. That's when I knew. I pushed past her, opened her closet, and there it was. My dress. Her own boyfriend sighed, "The gig is up." She was furious. I was victorious. I freaking knew it. Story 10. A coworker got a sudden promotion with zero experience. I had a gut feeling something was off. A few months later, the CEO and this coworker sat us all down and announced they'd recently started dating. Yeah, okay. The whole office knew they'd been sneaking around for over a year. Work-life balance? Not in this economy. Story 11. I was ordering illegal medicine for my cat from a lab in China in late 2019. Then orders suddenly stopped. Labs shut down early for Chinese New Year, which didn't make sense. I turned to my husband and said, "Something big is happening. Get ready to teach from home." 3 months later, COVID lockdowns. Meanwhile, my cat lived. So, small victories. Story 12. A guy at work always seemed off. Friendly enough, but something about him gave me that internal warning bell. A few months in, HR accidentally printed salary data on a shared printer. I saw his pay and thought, no way he's settling for that. He's making money somewhere else. Turns out, he was. Dude was embezzling thousands through fake expense reports. My gut? 10/10 accuracy. Story 13. A pawn shop near my grandparents' house always gave me the creeps. I went in as a kid to buy used video games, and the owner was just unsettling. Years later, I see his face on the news. Turns out he murdered his ex and incinerated her in the basement. Kept the secret for 15 years until his own sons turned him in. I freaking knew it. Story 14. Had a buddy who suddenly got rich, quit his job, bought a Mercedes, luxury apartment, multiple cars, claimed he made a killing in stocks and Forex. I told my friends, there's no way this guy made that much legally. They thought I was jealous. A year later, busted for running a Ponzi scheme. Everyone looked at me like, holy crap, you were right. Damn right I was. Story 15. A youth pastor at my ex's church gave me the worst vibes. He was upbeat, always smiling, but something about him just felt off. I refused to go back. My ex and her family thought I was nuts. Fast forward a year, arrested for child solicitation. Trust your gut, people. Story 16. My ex started acting weird, less affectionate, distant. Said he was overwhelmed with work, life, his baby mama drama, but insisted he adored me. Then I overheard her on the phone, pissed. This is a betrayal of trust. When I asked him about it, he claimed she was mad that he texted a female friend who lost her mom. My gut screamed BS. Sure enough, less than a month after he broke up with me, he was dating that friend. Story 17. I once worked with a guy in accounting who seemed off. He was friendly enough, but there was something about him that made my brain itch. Then HR accidentally printed out salary data and left it on a shared printer. I took one look at his pay and thought, no way is he settling for this. A few years later, turns out he'd been embezzling company funds for years, faking expense reports for everything from groceries to vacations. A junior employee finally caught it when an Amazon purchase didn't add up. I quit soon after, but man, I knew it. Story 18. A friend's wife walked past me in the hallway one day, and I blurted out, "She's pregnant." My friend laughed and said, "Nah, not that I know of." I shrugged, but I just knew. Couldn't explain it, just something about her screamed, "with child." A couple of weeks later, he calls me up. "Hey, guess what? She's pregnant." Called it. I should start charging people for my psychic services. Story 19. A pawn shop near my grandparents' house always felt wrong. The owner was nice, sure, but there was something about him that set off every alarm in my brain. Still, I'd go there to buy used video games. Fast forward a few years, he's all over the news. Turns out he murdered his ex, incinerated her in the basement, and got away with it for 15 years until his own sons turned him in. That creepy vibe? Fully justified. Story 20. Back in high school, a teacher announced she had news. Before she could say it, a kid blurted out, "You're pregnant." He looked immediately horrified, like he realized mid-sentence that he might have just made a huge mistake. The teacher paused and then confirmed it. She was pregnant. Apparently, another student had guessed earlier too. His reasoning? She used to hop up and sit on the counter during class, but hadn't in a while. Some people just have an eye for these things. Story 21. A town I used to live in had a fast fashion store that seemed Wrong. It was in a terrible location, never had customers, and the window displays never changed. Every time I drove by, I'd tell my partner, that place has to be a front. A year later, it was busted for running an illegal grow operation. I have never felt more validated. Story 22. There was an Italian restaurant in town owned by an actual Italian family. Place was great, but people always whispered about a rumored backroom casino. One day, the place gets raided, and sure enough, there was an entire hidden casino upstairs. The wildest part? The restaurant itself stayed open because the casino was technically separate. Also, there wasn't any cash kept on site, so no major charges stuck. Honestly, that's some next-level planning. Story 23. I was visiting my ex at college, and we went to her church. The youth pastor seemed like a textbook good guy, friendly, upbeat, always smiling, but I couldn't stand him. Something felt off. I refused to go back. My ex and her family thought I was overreacting. A year later, he was arrested for child solicitation. Always trust your gut. Story 24. I once had a mentor figure in my husband's life that I just couldn't warm up to. I tried to ignore it, thinking I was being overly sensitive. One day, we casually mentioned that I was doing some spring cleaning and getting rid of some old supernatural merch and my estranged mom's witchy stuff. Without missing a beat, she suggested, right in front of me, that my husband should leave me. Spent the rest of the call trying to convince him I was secretly practicing witchcraft and lying about being Christian. The whole family finally saw what I had been saying all along. Story 25. My sister once wanted to borrow my dress for a wedding, and I told her no. The next day it was missing. I confronted her, and she went full meltdown mode, swearing she never took it. She even made me apologize for accusing her. A week later, I went to her place, grabbed some comfy clothes from her closet, and she freaked out. That's when I knew. I threw open her closet doors, and there it was, my dress. Her boyfriend sighed, "The gig is up." The way she looked at him like he'd committed treason? Priceless. Story 26. A buddy of mine got really rich, really fast. Quit his job, bought a Mercedes, luxury apartment, multiple cars, said he was killing it in stocks and Forex. I told my friends no way he made that much money legally. They thought I was just being salty. A year later, busted for running a Ponzi scheme. Everyone was shocked. Me, not so much. Story 27. Had a new hire at work that I just knew was trouble. Told my hiring manager, got called sexist. 4 months later, she was caught stealing thousands from the registers and got 2 people fired because she was sleeping with the store manager. Now she's serving time. And guess who gets to sit in on hiring meetings? That's right. Me. Story 28. I worked at a company where HR accidentally printed out salary data. I took one look at a certain coworker's pay and thought, no way is she okay with that. A few years later, turns out she'd been embezzling tens of thousands through fake expense reports. My gut was 100% correct. Story 29. My grandma has this habit of whispering to my grandpa while he's watching TV, then yelling, "Why are you ignoring me?" When he doesn't respond, we've all witnessed it. The man will be peacefully reading, and she'll murmur something so low you'd need sonar to pick it up. The moment he doesn't answer, full-volume accusations of neglect. I think she just enjoys yelling at him. Story 30. When my son was 14, he lost 30 pounds in a few months. I wasn't super worried at first because he had started on the heavier side, but then he went to Mexico for a week with his dad and came back another 10 pounds lighter. Alarm bells started going off. My brother has type 1 diabetes. Then he got a migraine so bad he couldn't function. I took him to the pediatrician and insisted on a blood sugar test. The doctor brushed me off, praising his weight loss. I refused to leave without the test. Sure enough, his blood sugar was nearly 500. Sometimes moms just know. Also, screw that doctor. Story 31. One time, my dad's company laid off an entire department while they were at lunch. These poor people came back, and their key cards didn't work. Someone from HR had to step outside to tell them they no longer had jobs. 2 weeks before Christmas, If companies are going to pull crap like that, then no one should ever feel bad about quitting without notice. Story 32. There was a guy in my PhD program who was ridiculously productive. No one gets perfect results all the time in science, but somehow he did. He flew through grad school, crushed his postdoc, and became a professor at a big university. A year in, his former postdoc lab figured out they couldn't replicate any of his work. Turns out, he had fabricated over 60% of his results. His grants were revoked, and he was fired. Dude built his whole career on lies, and it took 10 years to catch him. Story 33. In high school, my ex was part of a band and got really close with one of the other guys. They always had a weird energy, but I told myself I was overthinking it. When we broke up, I tried to stay friends and even cried to this guy about how hard it was. A few months later, they were dating. Turns out my gut wasn't wrong after all. Story 34. A guy at my old job always gave me the creeps. Just something about him felt predatory. I avoided being alone with him whenever possible. One day, the police show up, real quiet-like, and spread out through the building, posted at every exit. Next thing we know, they're walking him out in handcuffs. Months later, we find out he was arrested for sexually assaulting one of his tenants and had hidden cameras in the bathrooms of his rental properties. And the cherry on top? He sent threats to his victim from his work computer. HR guy, by the way, you can't make this stuff up. Story 35. My ex-husband used to act like I was insane for being suspicious of his behavior. He'd get irrationally mad if I watched a movie with an attractive guy, accused me of checking out random men in public, full paranoia mode. One day, he got weirdly defensive when I saw an unknown number pop up on his phone. Turns out it was his side piece. And the kicker? He'd been cheating for months and was just trying to create a reason to break up with me first. Projection at its finest. Story 36. Back when I was a kid, I used to check out pawn shops after Christmas to spend my money on used video games. There was one where the owner was chatty but gave off the absolute worst vibes. Something about the place felt suffocating. Years later, I saw his face on the news. He had murdered his ex and incinerated her in the basement. Got away with it for 15 years until his own sons turned him in. I still get chills thinking about it. Story 37. A guy at work got a sudden promotion that made 0 sense. He had no experience, no qualifications, but somehow ended up in a cushy office job. I immediately suspected something. A few months later, he and the CEO called a meeting to announce they were dating. They claimed it was new, but the whole office had already pieced it together long before. Nobody was shocked, just annoyed. Story 38. A youth pastor at my ex's church gave me the worst gut feeling. Nothing obvious, just something in the way he carried himself. I refused to go back, and everyone told me I was overreacting. A year later, arrested for child solicitation. I don't know how I knew, but I knew. Story 39. I once told my mom that my little brother had Tourette's, not based on any medical knowledge, just from watching too much Maury Povich as a kid. She got mad at me, said I was being ridiculous. Years later, after tons of medical testing, diagnosed with Tourette's. My unsolicited childhood diagnosis was apparently more accurate than the doctor's initial assessments. Story 40. Had a coworker who just seemed off. He was too productive, always had perfect results, never seemed to struggle. I knew something wasn't right. A few years later, his entire career imploded. Turns out he had been fabricating his research for over a decade. He lost his grants, got fired, and was completely blacklisted. Science doesn't work that cleanly, man. Should have been more subtle. Story 41. A friend of mine suddenly got rich overnight. New Mercedes, fancy apartment, talking about investments, but never actually explaining anything. I told my other friends, there's no way this is legit. They laughed it off. A year later, busted for running a Ponzi scheme. Sometimes being a hater just means you have good instincts. Story 42. My sister needed a dress for a wedding. I told her she couldn't borrow mine. The next day it was missing. I confronted her and she acted completely offended, even got me to apologize for accusing her. A week later I went to her place, grabbed some comfy clothes from her closet and she freaked out. That's when it clicked. I threw open her closet doors, and sure enough, my dress. Her boyfriend sighed. The gig is up. I have never seen someone so mad about getting caught red-handed. Story 43. Back in 2019, I was ordering illegal meds for my cat from China. Suddenly, the labs all shut down early for Chinese New Year, which made no sense. People stopped getting their shipments, and I turned to my husband and said, "Something big is happening. You need to start planning how to teach from home." 3 months later, COVID lockdowns. Meanwhile, my cat survived, so I guess it all worked out. Story 44. When I was 14, my dad's company laid off an entire department while they were at lunch. They came back, and their keycards didn't work. HR had to come outside and break the news. 2 weeks before Christmas. And yet, companies will cry about how unprofessional it is to quit without notice. Story 45. My wife is totally fine sitting in silence for hours, but the moment I start the vacuum, run the microwave, or flush the toilet, suddenly she wants to tell me her life story. And it's never a simple ask. It's an elaborate, multi-layered speech that I have to decode over the sound of running water. Then, if I try to summarize and cut to the point, I'm being rude. I don't even fight it anymore. I just accept my fate. Story 46. There was a super fancy Chinese restaurant in my city that made insane money. Then one day, boom, shut down. Turns out the owners had a chain of restaurants in Dallas that got busted for human trafficking. A month later, this one reopened under new management, but it was the same sign, same menu, same staff, and somehow people just went right back to eating there. Story 47. A friend of mine's wife walked past me one day, and I just blurted out, "She's pregnant." He laughed and said, "Not that I know of." I shrugged it off. A couple of weeks later, he calls me up, "Dude, she's pregnant." I don't know how I knew, I just did. Story 48. A comic book shop in my town had a free-play Simpsons arcade machine. My buddy and I checked it out, but the store itself was empty. Random junk comics, barely any stock, no customers. We left joking, "That place is definitely a front." A year later, busted for selling meth. And honestly, if I had known, I wouldn't have had to make 2 trips, to play Simpsons and score meth. Efficiency matters. Story 49. I was sitting in the waiting room at my therapist's office when I saw a newspaper headline about my old school. The front page showed cops carrying a casino gaming table out the front door. Turns out my school had been running an illegal casino for years, right in the middle of our gym. We were just kids using the tables as home base during tag, not knowing they were pulling in $15 million a year from high-stakes gambling. Meanwhile, our tuition was $50 a month. Now it all makes sense. Story 50. Back in high school, my ex was in a band with this guy she was really close with. Something about their interactions bugged me. When we broke up, I tried to stay civil and even cried on this guy's shoulder about how painful it was. A few months later, guess who she was dating? Yup, should have trusted my gut. Story 51. There was a fast fashion store in my town that never had customers. I told my partner, "That place has to be a front." A year later, it got busted for running an illegal grow operation. You just know when something isn't right. Story 52. A former co-worker of mine always had perfect results. Science doesn't work that way. Nobody's experiments are successful every single time. I told people there's no way this guy isn't fudging data. Years later, it came out that he had fabricated over 60% of his results. He lost everything. My gut? 10/10. Story 53. My stepdad used to do weird things around my stepsisters. I always had a bad feeling, but as a kid I didn't know what to do. Years later they finally spoke up and it all came out. He was exactly as awful as I feared. He's in prison now, and I just hope he's suffering. Story 54. My dad divorced my mom when I was 5 and insisted on paying a ridiculously high child support amount just to flex. Years later, he got his new girlfriend pregnant and suddenly had an epiphany. He needed to adjust the payments. But in a touching fatherly moment, he reassured me it wasn't to shortchange me. No, he was just going to put half of the difference into a savings account for me and half for my soon-to-be sister. Never saw a single dime. Not me, not her. Brought it up years later, and he acted like I made the whole thing up. A gaslighting masterpiece. Story 55. A guy I worked with always seemed too smooth. He got promoted way too fast, never had to deal with office politics, and seemed to always be in the right place at the right time. I told a coworker, something about him isn't right. A couple of years later it came out, he was embezzling money. Turns out he had been faking invoices, rerouting payments, and pulling in tens of thousands of dollars under the radar. He got caught when a junior employee flagged a random Amazon expense. I called it from day one. Story 56. A private Facebook group at work randomly locked everyone out one morning. I turned to my coworker and said, "Something's happening." They laughed it off. Probably just a glitch. A few hours later, management rolled in with layoff notices like Oprah giving out cars. The look on my coworker's face when they realized I was right? Priceless. Story 57. A couple of months before COVID hit, I was buying illegal medicine from China for my cat. Out of nowhere, the lab stopped shipping orders. Then people started reporting that their money was taken, but nothing was being sent. Next, the lab suddenly closed early for Chinese New Year. I turned to my husband and said, "Something big is happening." By January, I told him to start prepping to teach from home. 3 months later, lockdowns. My cat lived, so there's that. Story 58. A comic book store in my town had a 4-player Simpsons arcade machine set to free play. My buddy and I went in to check it out, and the place was weird. No real inventory, random stacks of junk comics, and no customers. We left joking, "That place has to be a front." A year later, busted for selling meth. And I'm just saying, if I had known, I wouldn't have had to make 2 trips to play Simpsons and score meth. Story 59. I was planning a sabbatical from work, and just had this weird sense of dread about it. I even told my boss I don't know why, but it feels like I shouldn't go. She reassured me, said I deserved the break. A week later, I got a meeting invite from my boss's boss. Before I even opened the email, I knew. Zoom call, VP of Engineering, laid off. My gut was screaming at me for a reason. Story 60. My wife has a talent for waiting until I'm actively occupied to suddenly need to talk. She can sit in silence for an hour, but the second I start doing dishes or turn on the vacuum, she launches into a winding monologue. And it's never direct. No, "Can you get the kid's water bottle?" It's, "I think the kid might be thirsty. I gave her a water bottle this morning, but maybe she finished it already. And I think there's an extra in the pantry. But wait, maybe it's in the box near the fireplace. Actually, we should move that box." By the time I yell, "Do you want me to just get the bottle?" I'm the rude one. Story 61. My stepdad always gave me bad vibes. He'd act overly nice in front of people, but something about how he treated my stepsisters never sat right with me. I was just a kid, so I didn't know what to do, but I saw things. Things that didn't feel right. Fast forward 13 years, and my stepsisters finally spoke up. He had been abusing them the entire time. He's in prison now, and I hope every single day is worse than the last for him. Story 62. I once met a youth pastor at my ex's church, and the second I shook his hand, I hated him. Nothing outwardly wrong, he was friendly, upbeat, had that classic, cool pastor energy. But something in my gut screamed, "Nope!" I refused to go back. My ex and her family thought I was being weird. A year later, arrested for child solicitation. Trust your instincts. Story 63. There was an Italian restaurant in my town owned by a real Italian family. Place was great, but rumors swirled about a hidden casino upstairs. One day it got raided, and sure enough, there was an entire gambling operation up there. The best part? It didn't even hurt the restaurant, because the upstairs floor wasn't technically connected to it, and they never kept cash on site. They basically ran a full casino under law enforcement's nose and barely got in trouble for it. That's some next-level strategy. Story 64. There was a guy in HR at my job who always gave me the creeps. Something about him felt off, and I avoided being alone with him. Then one day, cops showed up at the office, spread out by all the exits, and quietly arrested him. A few months later, we found out why. He had hidden cameras in the bathrooms of his rental properties and had been sexually assaulting one of his tenants. Oh, and the best part? He sent threats to her from his work computer. A literal HR guy. Story 65. Had a mentor figure in my husband's life that I just couldn't trust. Couldn't put my finger on why. Tried to ignore it. Then, one day, during a casual phone call, we mentioned I was spring cleaning, tossing out some supernatural merch and old witchy stuff from my estranged mom. Immediately, she suggested my husband should leave me. Spent the rest of the call trying to convince him I was secretly a witch and lying about being Christian. The whole family finally saw what I had been saying all along. Story 66. My sister wanted to borrow my dress for a wedding. I said no. The next day it was gone. Called her, she denied it, got mad that I even accused her. A week later, I was at her house, grabbed some comfy clothes from her closet, and she freaked out. That's when I knew. I threw open her closet, and there it was, my dress. Her boyfriend sighed, "The gig is up." I have never seen someone so mad about getting caught red-handed. Story 67. A guy I worked with suddenly got rich overnight. Quit his job, bought a Mercedes, started talking about stocks and Forex, but never actually explained how he made his money. I told my friends, "There's no way this is legit." They thought I was just being cynical. A year later, busted for running a Ponzi scheme. I love being right. Story 68. My grandma has a fun little habit where she whispers something to my grandpa while he's watching TV and then immediately yells at him when he doesn't respond. We've all seen it. The man will be peacefully reading, and she'll murmur something so low only a bat could hear it. The moment he doesn't answer, "Why are you ignoring me?" I swear she just likes having a reason to yell. Story 69. There was a fast fashion store in my town that never had customers. No foot traffic, no employees ever seen going in or out, nothing. Every time I drove by, I told my partner, that place has to be a front. A year later, busted for running an illegal grow operation. Some things just scream sketchy. Story 70. A former coworker always had perfect results. Science doesn't work like that. Nobody's experiments are successful every single time. I told people, there's no way he's not fudging data. Years later, it came out that he had fabricated over 60% of his research. Got fired, lost his grants, completely blacklisted. Science caught up with him eventually.